Hello, everyone, and welcome back. I'm Joe Chappelle, and you're listening to episode 65 of the OBGYN podcast. Today, I have Jerry Ballas back again to discuss the trials and tribulations of progesterone to prevent preterm birth. Hey, Jerry.
Joseph, how are you tonight?
Oh, doing very, very well. How about yourself?
Oh, can't complain. Living the dream.
Well, aren't we all? So, speaking of dreams, no. Actually, there's a dream here, and the dream is to prevent preterm labor, so maybe that's not the worst segue in the world. Actually, before I get into that, I got some listener feedback on our last episode, which people seem to enjoy. But one of the things that came out of this, and I think there's going to end up being a whole episode about this, maybe with the person who's been corresponding with me, but we as doctors, and I think I addressed this a little bit in our last episode, we are trained in medicine, by medicine, for medicine. And so they're saying that, to the man with a hammer, the entire world's a nail. And so we tend to think about solutions in terms of what the medical establishment or the field can do. And what her point was, and she's a midwife, was that there's so much outside of what is traditional medicine that actually may be perfect for filling this fourth trimester role, such as postpartum doulas and midwives and other things that we didn't really bring up in our episode. I think she's right, and we didn't bring those up because we don't live that. But I don't think it has to be a medical solution to some of these fourth trimester issues. Anyway, I just wanted to bring that feedback up, and then we'll address that further in the next episode or in a couple episodes. But I don't know if before I move on, Jerry, you have any thoughts about that? Because it was kind of profound to me.
Well, no, I think a great place to continue the conversation is going to be in March in Denver, because that's really what a lot of our conference is going to be about, is the full spectrum of fourth trimester care is exactly what this person's talking about. It's not entirely through a doctor's office. And so looking at it the lens of the village, which is how I kind of frame it, that involves all sorts of providers and people that can take part in the care. And I think if we can diversify it and we can normalize fourth trimester care amongst our policymakers and legislators, secondly, amongst families themselves, and then amongst the medical community, I think we can find a more multidisciplinary way of approaching the fourth trimester. Absolutely.
Yeah, agreed. And that was a good plug for the MPA again. So absolutely, again, if you're interested in this stuff, Denver, end of March, going to be a great conference. So today's subject, as we talked about, is progesterone to prevent preterm labor. And as someone who started training in 2007, and Jerry was a year before that, we kind of lived through this period of upheaval in how we can prevent preterm birth, if we can. But it really started in the 1960s, actually. So between 1964 and 1985, there were 8 trials that took place looking at the use of progesterone in pregnancy. A lot of these were looking at women with a history of miscarriage to see if progesterone can prevent miscarriage, because we do know that progesterone made by the corpus luteum does play a role in miscarriage. If you remove the corpus luteum, you have a miscarriage. So people knew that, and they were extrapolating, okay, well, if it's some miscarriages are a deficiency in progesterone, if we give progesterone, maybe we'll prevent miscarriage. Well, as it turns out, it had no effect on miscarriage at all. But they did find in a couple of studies that it actually decreased the odds of preterm birth and preterm labor. And so there was a meta-analysis done in 1990 by Kearse, and they found that, that's what they found, that maybe there is a decrease in preterm birth and preterm labor, if not miscarriage. So this was picked up by the NICHD and the MFM network by Paul Mies. Did I say right?
Mies.
Okay, I keep saying it wrong. Paul Mies. And they did a study where they did a randomized control study. Women included were 15 to 20 weeks with a history of spontaneous preterm birth. They were all given 250 milligrams of 17-hydroxyprogesterone IM weekly or castor oil. The progesterone was suspended in castor oil, so they basically used the suspension medium without the active ingredient. And interestingly, and this is going to become important later in the story, they actually had to do the study twice. So the first time they had to stop after 10 months because there was a manufacturing issue where the company said that our drug is contaminated, so they had to stop, and they had to completely restart the whole trial with a new company. And that actually is going to feed into what the FDA did later. So they had a sample size of 500. They enrolled 463, and they found, and this is where some of the criticism is going to come in their control group, so the people who got castor oil, there was a 55% essentially rate of preterm birth in people with a history. And in the progesterone group, it was 36%. So they said this is a success. We actually reduced the preterm birth rate from 55% to 36% by giving IM progesterone. Well, a group from Duke and a couple of people, they noted that, hey, that rate of preterm birth in the control group is super high, 55%. And we'll see later when we talk about the PROLONG study, which is how we got here, the rate was actually, the historical rate is much, much lower than that. And so they thought, well, if this is so low, if so high, how do you know that your study was done correctly? Maybe there was some bias in there or something else. But in any case, a lot of people ran with this. And Jerry, this is when we were training this 2003 to 2007 period. And by at least 2007, when I was starting as an intern, everybody was getting IM progesterone. I don't know if you remember this tradition here, but...
Oh, please. I actually cite my intern year when I went to the District 2 meeting where Kathy Spong was the keynote speaker talking about... they were basically on the circuit at that point, talking about the NIH trial and the reemergence of progesterone as a preventative tool. So yeah, from my intern year, it caught fire at that point in terms of offering the 17-OHP.
Yeah. And we have talked on this podcast a few times about how, interestingly, in a field that is relatively conservative, we will take a new thing and we will run with it without any confirmatory studies, without anything. We'll adopt fetal heart rate monitoring. We'll give everyone 17-hydroxyprogesterone based on basically one study. All sorts of things. We will stop using mechanical, morcellators during hysterectomy because of one study. And again, I'm not saying I argue with that necessarily, but we take one study and we run with it as a field, which isn't necessarily all that great.
I think it kind of speaks a little to the acuity of the work we do, especially when it involves newborns, when it involves preterm birth, etc. We work in a field where, fortunately and unfortunately, we're in a society where perfection is expected. The perfect outcome is expected on a society level in terms of pregnancy. So we are so primed to both adopt and reject things depending on whether they're going to affect that outcome. And I think with progesterone, we had years and years of data to show it's not harmful, right? We're pretty certain that it doesn't cause in very large, in the doses we're talking about, effects to the fetus or outcomes or to newborns. It's well tolerated. It's not a it's not a medication that really has ever caused any red flags in terms of side effects. And so I think it was very exciting. Plus, it went through a multi-center, right, randomized trial, which I think it basically checked off all the boxes for what people want to hear in terms of gold standard trials, right? Blinded, multi-center. The MFM Units Network at that point had been kicking it into high gear in terms of what they were putting out and the numbers they were able to produce, which prior to that, we really had just institutional level data for a lot of the research we were depending on. So I think you put all those factors together. Plus, we really had nothing to offer women at that point for any kind of preventative method for preterm birth.
I mean, that's a really good point. Since we deal with literally life and death, especially for newborns and neonates, that if we can even shave 1% off of that, and there's no downsides, then obviously we should do it, right? And if we don't do it, then I don't want to call it negligence, but it's not good, right?
Right.
So it does push us into adopting some of these things. Now, it's interesting to me, I'll go through the history a little bit more in a second, that the PROLONG trial published 2019 now, and the first study was 2003. So that's 16 years. Mm-hmm. And this is the first time someone's really repeated this study in the way that they did. And that, to me, is a little bit baffling. We talk a little bit on the show about it's okay to publish the same thing 2 or 3 times. And actually, I have this argument with a resident sometimes. Well, someone already did that. I'm like, well, yeah, they did it.
Right.
But there were 100 people, and it was just one place. Like, there's room to do that again, because maybe we won't find the same thing, or maybe we will.
Right.
And that just, adds to the strength of their findings. But it's okay to publish a thing 2 or 3 times in different places to make sure we actually have a true effect. And that's what, as medicine in a field, not just OBGYN, we struggle with this. And also in our top tier journals, maybe they don't want to publish the same thing they published last time, especially if it's another retrospective trial with 100 women. Well, we did that once already. That's enough. But it's not. So I don't know. I don't know how to get out of that, but it's just a thought.
Well, I mean, if you think about it, though, this is the natural progression. So we had institutional level, academic center level data leading up to that point. You had alluded to, the review that had been done in the 90s to show some benefit. Well, then we kicked it up a notch and did a multi-center trial, but that was only in academic centers in the United States. And now as we take a more global view, well then, do we start validating what we find in large U.S. studies with international partners? And that's one of the eternal debates, because there's always going to be a bias with European studies or international studies, and whether they're reproducible in America and whether we should quote unquote trust them or believe them. And so now we're seeing the other way, and it's been interesting to see the reaction to an American study being invalidated in some ways on an international scale.
Right. So this, people ran off with this, and from 2003 until 2011, the only way for a woman to get progesterone was to get it from a compounding pharmacy, pretty much. And there were a number of them. Again, although they're regulated by the FDA, they're not necessarily overseen like a big pharmaceutical company is, because they're mixing the drug per patient, so it introduces some variability to that. Now, what's important to the story is that each injection costs about $15. So for a course of a pregnancy, you're getting it every week. It's about $300 a pregnancy, which is very, very affordable. So again, for $300, there's no side effects. I mean, hey, why not, right?
Right.
Even if it helps, one person out of 100, it's probably still worth it.
Right.
Right. Well, then the FDA has something called an orphan drug program, where there's a drug like 17-hydroxyprogesterone that no big manufacturing pharmaceutical company is making. Somebody can come in and claim that and basically get a patent on it, like they did if they had created it new. And the FDA does that because there are many drugs that people want. You need a steady supply of. I remember there's an issue back in the 1980s where basically everyone got hydralazine for preeclampsia, and then the company that made hydralazine, I can't remember, either went out of business or the FDA shut something down for a while for issues, and no one in the country could get hydralazine. And obviously that's a big deal, right? And so the FDA wants people to be able to make this stuff. And so to entice them to do that, is okay, sure, you make it, and we'll give you basically a monopoly on that for a certain number of years, and we all make out. Great. So a company called KV Pharmaceutical came in and claimed that, and they marketed it under the brand name Makena. Now, unfortunately, what they did to that is they increased the price of it from $15 a dose to $1,440 a dose. And Jerry and I, we lived through this. And it was, the amount of hand-wringing and angst that went along with this, because suddenly these women couldn't get it. Their insurance companies wouldn't approve it. The compounding pharmacies were initially told they couldn't make it anymore because they didn't have, there wasn't their brand anymore. And it was very, very difficult for probably about 6 months. I don't know what your recollections were, Jerry.
Oh, I have another first-person recollection. My first year of fellowship is when this all went down. I was in our high-risk clinic at UCSD with Bob Resnick, and he was not having it. He was on the phone. I remember for all different clinic days, getting on the phone with the reps from KV, getting on the phones with the reps from Medi-Cal to talk about the travesty that these women were not going to be able to get the medication for any affordable price. And he was just beside himself. It was incredible to see this kind of pillar of maternal fetal medicine just kind of beside himself, trying to figure out how a company could just come in, reverse engineer, and basically game the system. Because it wasn't just the orphan drug part that they kind of gamed, but they also took that subpart H accelerated pathway, which basically allowed them to use someone else's outcome, so basically the Mies trial's outcome, as their proxy outcome, to kind of couple it with the orphan drug protocol and basically put it to a council vote, which is what it came down to, was a FDA council vote. And the reason this trial even happened, the PROLONG trial, is because the disagreement that happened at the council level. Because the initial outcome of less than 30, remember, this was for less than 37 weeks, was what they were talking about as preventing preterm birth. Most of the people on the FDA council didn't feel like that was actually a real powerful finding in terms of neonatal outcomes and so forth. Less than 35 weeks, you started to see the council vote be like, if we could see an effect less than 35 weeks, we'd be really more prone to give you full FDA approval. And less than 32 weeks, definitely, because we know less than 32 weeks, that's going to have a huge impact on if you could prevent that in terms of prematurity and the outcomes. So this is where the 35-week cutoff came for PROLONG, is that this is where there was a tip in the FDA initial approval for where they think it would have been enough to give full FDA approval. So they did get approval, but they were required to run this secondary study.
Right, and that's very important. It's going to lead to this prolonged study as you talked about, and it goes to show you that the FDA is not there's not some czar that runs it. It does have to go to the council,
right?
And it is interesting, like you said, that they didn't have to do their own research prior to approval. Most companies, Pfizer or whatever, they make a new heart medication, they have to run probably 7 different trials before they can market it, right? And that was skipped over here in this process. And we've talked about a little bit here and there about the FDA, and I always feel they're in a really hard bind, right? They have to approve new medications as soon as possible because, in this case, you could be preventing all of these preterm births, which leads to morbidity and healthcare costs. At the same time, they want to ensure that A, the drug works, and that B, it's safe, right? And those two things are competing because it might take 5 years to do those studies to make sure that it's safe and effective. But at the same time, if there's some compelling evidence that it works, are we damning 5 years worth of newborns or neonates to be premature? And that's a hard thing to do. How do you balance that? I don't know, but thank God I'm not in the FDA council.
I mean, honestly, I think this is one example of how they balance that. Because I think, given the nature of progesterone, like we talked about, fairly good safety profile, decent data from the MEAS trial, at least suggestive and compelling. Mm-hmm. So they did give preliminary approval, but the requirement was to run a larger, longer-term trial, and which is what they did with the PROLONG. And so I think this speaks to your point. They have these mechanisms in place to get something into the hands of people while working on the better data collecting and safety profile. The ugly part was, they basically gave the pharmaceutical company free rein to cash in on it. And I think that's what really, really kind of poisoned the well in terms of the response people had to this company, as well as the anticipation for the results of this study, which I think are also being colored by this way that they went about early on marketing and basically cashing in as best quickly as they could.
Yeah, they went 100-fold on the price. So there was an outcry, as Jerry said, and I heard it too. And so the company did end up reducing the price by 50%, down to $600 and something per dose, which is still much more than $15 a dose, but much better than $1,400. And then there was this, people had this argument. Well, all right, how much is this drug worth? Well, if it really reduces preterm birth, which we know costs a lot of money as far as NICU admission, morbidity, long-term mortality, long-term morbidity, then maybe $15,000 for the pregnancy is worth it, right? And you can easily make that argument. If it actually works and you're decreasing the rate of preterm birth by, and the other study by not quite 50%, but 30%, that's going to save a lot of money just in NICU costs, right? Forget even about long-term morbidity and mortality, right? So you can make an argument pretty easily that $15,000 is nothing when you compare it to a stay in the NICU. Mm-hmm. But that means that it has to work. Right. So let's get into the PROLONG study. It's actually published ahead of, it's online right now. It's not actually yet published. Now, just to read some places where it was done, Jerry mentioned that this was a much bigger place, bigger study. So it was done in Houston, Columbia, Louisiana, Duke, Tampa, North Carolina, Tucson, Arizona. There we go. California, Galveston, San Antonio, Idaho, Ukraine, Russia, UMass. Actually, the pharmaceutical companies, Mass, and then Mexico for the pharmaceutical companies. So as you can see, it's very heavily weighted to the America, but also does have the Ukraine and the Russia sites, so it is a little bit more international, and certainly lots and lots of places that we're recruiting. This is not a journal club, so we're not going to run through the entire trial. But Jerry, since you're a little more steeped in this than I am, what do you think the major findings, like what was the major difference between this trial and the other trial?
Well, I think the biggest argument, so it's been interesting because our major societies, SMFM and ACOG, still have not come down fully on the side of prolonged trial, invalidating or proving, quote unquote, that progesterone does not work, because the biggest argument is the disparity in population that from the MEAS trial to the prolonged trial. The overall Caucasian aspect of the prolonged trial, I mean, greater than 80%, what was it, 87% Caucasian.
Right.
Only 12% with greater than one spontaneous preterm birth, low smoking rates, 90% married. You know, all of these point towards a socioeconomic status in total that is higher than a lot of the women involved in the MEAS trial, and frankly, a lot of women that get care in the United States. I mean, that's going to be a big part of this discussion, is that they didn't quite power it to look for the outcomes of the MEAS trial necessarily. And so they would have needed about 3,000 people to fully power it to match the MEAS trial in terms of preterm birth rates and so forth, but they didn't have that. So it is a negative study. It's a big number, 3 times the number of participants than in the MEAS trial. But if you look at the populations themselves, they look so distinctly different than what a lot of us in academic centers throughout the country treat in terms of risk factors and so forth. So that's going to be the hard part to really tease out of all of this.
Yeah. I mean, I think we run into this trouble when we take prior data and try to power our study based on that prior data.
Right.
One of our MFMs did a study on wound infection, I think it was, or maybe it was endometritis, I can't remember. But their historical rate was, 15%,
right.
And they went and did their study, and what they actually found was 7%. And so, of course, they were massively underpowered because they had powered 15%, and that they had a negative finding, but did they have a negative finding because it was negative or because they were underpowered?
Exactly.
And that's hard. And especially, since the criticism to begin with the first trial was about the fact that the preterm birth rate was so high, if you're powering it based on that, I hate to go back in Monday morning quarterback people, but if people already complained that rate was so high, why did they power their study based on that? Right.
I mean, that's the thing. For the background preterm birth rate that they ended up with, which was about 20-something%, basically half the rate of the original MEAS trial, you need twice the numbers at that point. So, I mean, on one hand, they maybe should have planned for that, but I think the problem also becomes is trying to run this trial with basically the horses out of the barn. So, in terms of trying to recruit, not just in the U.S., which is pretty much a lost cause. Once progesterone kind of got out there, trying to really get women who had zero access to it, who could really be randomized, free of any kind of bias, is pretty hard in the U.S.
Correct.
Also hard internationally. There are very few pockets where you're really going to find people that you could truly randomize, where their physicians may not be like suggesting, maybe you shouldn't do the trial in case you get the placebo. I mean, that's huge. So you should have probably at least anticipated having a much lower background preterm birth rate, because we live in an age where a lot of women are going to be steered towards what's already on the market, and not going to be encouraged to do randomized trials where they may not get the treatment.
Mm-hmm. It's hard. It's kind of like electronic fetal monitoring again. Once you've wholesale adopted it across the entire health spectrum, how do you do a trial where you don't use it?
Right. Exactly.
It becomes a standard of care.
Right.
And then if you have a bad outcome, whether it is related to the absence or not, that's your standard. You're being judged against standard of care, whether it's a good standard or not. And that's what they ran against here. I will say one of the things, at least I didn't see in the Muse trial, you can correct me, Jerry, if I'm wrong, is they didn't look at the number of prior spontaneous preterm births. It was either or.
There has been sub-analysis to that. It's just the power drops off because of numbers. And they do see greater benefit in women with more higher histories, greater numbers of preterm births, spontaneous preterm births in the past. And that's also going to be hard to reproduce this day and age, because how many women are you going to have with repetitive history of spontaneous preterm birth who hadn't gotten treated at some point with progesterone at this point? But yeah, there's definitely I think a dose response to decreasing risk with the number of spontaneous preterm births.
Right. I mean, it would kind of make sense. We know that if you give a treatment to someone who is the biggest risk for it, that you're more likely to have a positive outcome out of it, right?
Right.
Or some difference. If you take someone who's never had a preterm birth, actually, let's take baby aspirin, right?
Right.
If you give baby aspirin to everybody, yeah, it's most likely going to decrease the risk of getting preeclampsia. However, if your baseline risk is already pretty low, then because you've had 3 kids without preeclampsia, then the baby aspirin is going to have almost no effect, right?
Right.
If you've had preeclampsia in 3 of your previous pregnancies, well, it's probably going to make a big difference.
Exactly.
Right? And so it's probably the same thing here. So I don't know. I don't have a ton to say about progesterone. I also, although I in general these days disagree with almost everything ACOG does, and SMFM for that matter, I don't think they're wrong here. I do think that their full-throated support of hydroxyprogesterone to begin with was probably wrong. But I also don't think that because we have one trial that says it works and one trial that says it doesn't work, that we should completely abandon it. Right. I think there needs to be more work here. Now we have conflicting data. So now we need to design a better trial to try to do it one more time, a tiebreaker, if you will. Right. I don't know that you should say that it definitely works anymore. I think you say it's something that is available to women with a history of preterm birth, maybe more effective in women with more, and that it should be offered to women knowing that it may or may not do anything.
Right. I mean, I think a version of risk scoring is probably going to come out of this as well. I actually look at this data, in one way, the way I look at it is that it's an indictment of healthcare in this country, right? Where the Mies trial had a background preterm birth rate of 55%, like in their women. I mean, that tells me that there's more going into this multifactorial entity known as preterm birth than simply what do they tell us? Gap junctions that are minimized by progesterone or decreased inflammation because of progesterone. We don't even have a mechanism of action that we can really point to. But you're going to tell me that things like stressors at home, socioeconomic status, racism, the things that are alive and well and in huge quantities in certain pockets of this country compared to others, I think that's something to look at as well. But that's the harder thing to study and the harder thing to attack. How many uninsured we have compared to other countries, right? Access to healthcare in general, not just during pregnancy, but in general, what's the overall health status of the populations that are being studied? That's harder to report on and to quantify. But I think, honestly, the truth is somewhere maddeningly in the middle, as always. Do I think progesterone works for some women? Absolutely, I do. But can I pinpoint who that person is at this point? Not really. All I have to go off is these trials that are being published, right? And it's difficult to tease out because for so long we lump together African American and socioeconomic status, right? Just as an example, right? But we have really good data to show that African Americans tend to be the least responders to 17-alpha hydroxyprogesterone, right? So where they would get lumped into possibly lower socioeconomic status being a risk factor for preterm birth, well, our intervention's not going to work for them, apparently. So how do we address that, right? So I think this actually does point to the multifactorial nature of preterm birth. We need to attack it from more than just a magic pill point of view, like 17 alpha hydroxyprogesterone. In terms of how to counsel, I mean, I've had my first conversation this past week, basically telling them the data out there that's there, the overall safety profile of progesterone, what it goes into being on it. We've also started counseling about vaginal progesterone, because lost in all of this is Dave Fonseca's trial from the 2000s that also showed with vaginal progesterone a modest decrease in recurrent spontaneous preterm birth, about 10%. Right. So there's another option as well, vaginal progesterone nightly 100 milligrams, right? But then you have to worry about things like insurance. Are they going to provide it if it's not an FDA approved method for preventing preterm birth? And that's the indication we're giving it. So it's kind of a mixed bag. We're back in the wilderness in a lot of ways. And then, as a funny story, they've now labeled progesterone as a medication that has to be drawn up in a hood in clinic because of its potential dangers to workers.
I did not know that.
Yeah, so that's a fairly new December 1st regulation being rolled out, especially here in California. And none of our clinics have hoods.
Yeah,
so in order to draw up the medication to give a woman who's coming every week, we have to have a hood in order to do it, and proper protection. So that's thrown a monkey wrench into even offering it. So tell you the truth, we're probably going to start throwing up our hands and just not offer it in general.
Yeah, we wonder why healthcare costs so much.
It's unbelievable.
I mean, we had something similar a few years ago with methotrexate. Where in order to get methotrexate now, you have to not only have chemo gloves, then you also have to have a chemo disposable, like a bin that you can put it in, and you have to be chemo certified to give it. This is in New York. It's like it's a small dose of methotrexate for atopic. We're not giving methotrexate for whatever, cancer, right?
Another fun drug they've labeled under that, oxytocin.
I know. Yeah, we have the same problem here.
Beautiful. Anyway, so no,
it might make you happy, if you touch it. So, I think that goes into another corollary, which is cerclage.
Oh,
right?
Boy.
Right. Well, there's some evidence that cerclage works in some women.
Exactly.
Right. We don't know which women it's going to work in, but in some women. And so what do? Well, we offer it to a lot of women, and I'd say I don't know if it's going to help you or not, but it might. The side effect profile of cerclage is obviously much different than a side effect profile of progesterone. Some way progesterone is a safer thing to give than the cerclage is. But to me, it's almost a similar conversation now, because it's not like I'm going to give you this and you're going to not have a miscarriage or preterm birth. It's going to be I'm going to give this to you. I don't know what's going to happen, but it might help.
Right. But with cerclage, we do actually do at least some risk stratification. If it's not either cervical length, if it's not taking into account a woman's birth history, there is a little bit of triaging that goes on clinically based. If we see evidence of shortening or opening of a cervix, we offer. So there's a little more stratification going on with cerclage offering than with progesterone at this point. So I honestly think there's going to be some more modeling and some more risk scoring that's going to start happening in order to confidently prescribe progesterone.
What your listeners don't know is that Jerry's RD project was on our preterm delivery risk score. So he's really just touting his own score here. If you don't know.
Trademark. The ballot.
Yeah, that's right. All right. I mean, again, it's not a whole lot of technical thing to say, except that I feel like this is a constant thing that we do in OB, is that someone comes out with a new thing, we all adopt it, we look at it 10 years later and say, maybe it wasn't as good as we thought it was, or if we're lucky, that's what we say, and if we're unlucky, we say, that was actually harmful, and then we have to do soul searching. Our ACOG and SMFM are always 10 years behind in recommending what the right thing is based on the data. Right. And so, again, I don't have a magic bullet here. I just want us to think about when we read a new paper that seems like it has a great new thing, is to maybe stop for a second and say, okay, but maybe we should get another study before we wholesale adopt it.
Right.
I don't know, Jerry, any final thoughts on this one?
Well, I think it's going to be an interesting year to see how this goes down, and then you've got the overall, pharmaceutical industry influence angle on all of this. Because I can tell you also, the first SMFM, the year after AMAG, or what was KV, increased the price, their table at SMFM was literally put under a staircase in the least desirable part of the floor. And now you open up the Gray Journal and you're going to find a McKenna ad, within a couple of pages. You're going to see AMAG. AMAG actually offers a research scholarship, AMAG SMFM, public policy research grant for trainees. So it's been interesting to see the evolution over 10 years. For their part, they've had a bit of a mea culpa. They've transferred a lot of their funds to what they consider either educational or outreach or different philanthropical endeavors, which a lot of pharmaceutical companies do in order to kind of clean up their mess. And so that's going to be interesting to see. Now, do I think AMAG, has some sort of huge sway over these? No, they I'm sure they give a few $1,000s to get their ads in there, but perception is reality, right? And so when you open your journals and you see these companies that the society is going kid gloves with, one has to wonder, So just another angle to put on there, since I have so many non scientific angles on things.
Yeah, I mean, someday, God help us, Jerry or I might end up in ACOG or SMFM, and then we'll have to defend all these things that we're complaining about. But for now, we can sit on the outside and throw stones. All right, well, I think that's going to do it for tonight.
Great.
We'll probably hear more about this in the years to come, and we'll hear more stories like this. Believe it or not, I am still working on Diabetes and Pregnancy Part 2, and it's almost done. God help me.
There's another myth we can talk about. Hey. GDM. Oh boy.
Okay. All right. Well, we'll have to have Jerry on an episode after I publish my second one, and we can talk about diabetes and pregnancy. Until then, I hope you all having a nice holiday season, and we'll see you back next time.
Awesome. Thank you, Joe.
Jerry.
Appreciate it.